Welcome and thank you for joining us. My name is Dyan Mazurana. I'm a research professor at the Fletcher School, the Feinstein International Center, and the Friedman School at Tufts University. I'd like to welcome our distinguished panelists and participants from across the international policy, legal, scholarly, and human rights communities. Over 100 people from 24 different countries registered for today's webinar. It's a privilege to convene this discussion around our report, Legal Commitments, Systematic Violations, a comprehensive analysis of the Taliban and CEDAW obligations in Afghanistan from 2021 to 2025. This report reflects several years of collaborative research and analysis. The link to the full report is in the chat of today's meetings, and a recording of this webinar is available to everyone who registered. Several of the report's co-authors have joined us here today. They are Courtney Rossani, Sarah Haviland, Rio Ponce, Annie Levy, Altan van Gul Dununbaum, and Sejul Jain. Also joining me today for our discussion are four prominent experts on Afghanistan, women's and girls' rights, and CEDAW. Dr. Seema Samar is a report co-author. She's a distinguished visiting scholar at the Fletcher School at Tufts University, and she's the former chair of the Afghan Independent Human Rights Commission and a former UN Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights in Sudan. Rangita de Silva de Alvis is a renowned international women's human rights expert, a member of the UN Committee on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, and a distinguished adjunct professor of law and global leadership at the University of Pennsylvania Carey Law School. Mr. Richard Bennett is a human rights expert who has held numerous positions in Afghanistan, including Chief of the Human Rights Service at the United Nations Assistance Mission in Afghanistan, UNAMA. In 2022, Mr. Bennett was appointed the UN Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights in Afghanistan. Mr. Mohammad Farid Hamidi is an Afghan lawyer and human rights activist who served as Attorney General of Afghanistan from 2016 to 2021. As Attorney General, Mr. Hamidi supported the rule of law, reformation, and human rights. He focused on civic values and fighting against corruption, injustice, and violence against women and children. He is currently the Deputy Chair of the Afghanistan Human Rights Center. We've convened this international webinar to launch the report, Legal Commitments, Systematic Violations, which examines the relationship between the Taliban's governance in Afghanistan from August 2021 through October 2025 and Afghanistan's binding obligations under CEDAW. I'll briefly present the study's main findings and then invite each of the four panelists to make remarks. I'll ask them each one question and then open the floor to the audience to pose your questions. Please enter your questions in the Q&A link, and we'll attempt to get to as many of your questions as possible within the 1 hour we have allotted for our discussion today. At its core, the report, Legal Commitments, Systematic Violations, is a legal and evidentiary study. It asks a straightforward but critically important question. How do the Taliban's laws, policies, and practices align with or depart from Afghanistan's obligations under international law? To answer this, we conducted a multi-year analysis drawing on 379 sources, including UN documents, human rights and humanitarian reporting, legal and academic scholarship, and verified accounts. All findings were triangulated across independent sources to ensure accuracy and reliability. The report is the first structured around the first 16 articles of CEDAW, providing what is, to our knowledge, the first article-by-article analysis of Taliban governance through this legal framework. And I'll highlight three core findings. First, the report finds that the Taliban have institutionalized a system of gender-based discrimination that is incompatible with Afghanistan's obligations under CEDAW. This is not limited to a single sector or policy domain. Rather, it spans education, healthcare, employment, access to justice, freedom of movement, and participation in public and political life. Across these areas, the restrictions are not isolated or incidental. They are systematic, cumulative, and mutually reinforcing. Second, we find that the legal and institutional mechanisms that previously provided, even if imperfect, protections for women and girls have been systematically dismantled by the Taliban. The Taliban suspended the Constitution. Institutions such as the Ministry of Women's Affairs, the Office of the Attorney General, the Afghanistan Independent Human Rights Commission, and specialized legal bodies addressing violence against women and violence against children have been dissolved or rendered non-functional. In their place, new Taliban governance structures and enforcement mechanisms have been introduced that formalize and enforce restrictions on women's and girls' lives and rights. This shift is not simply a rollback of rights. It represents a reconfiguration of the legal and institutional environment that is fundamentally at odds with international human rights obligations. Third, the report finds that the cumulative impacts of these measures is the large-scale exclusion of women and girls from social, economic, political, civic, and cultural life. This exclusion has significant implications not only for individual lives and rights, but also for household welfare, access to essential services, service delivery, broader societal stability, and Afghanistan's standing in the international community. Importantly, while there are some variations in enforcement across regions in Afghanistan, these variations do not alter the overall pattern. The restrictions are widespread, regular, and implemented with near total impunity. A central legal point underpinning this analysis is that Afghanistan's obligations under CEDAW remain in force. Treaty obligations do not disappear with changes in government or questions of international recognition. As the de facto authorities exercising control over the territory, the Taliban are bound by Afghanistan's existing international commitments. And this has important implications for how we understand accountability. It situates the current developments not only as a matter of policy or governance, but also as a question of compliance with binding international legal obligations. At the same time, our report is situated within a broader and evolving international context. There are increasing efforts to address the Taliban's systematic violation of women's and girls' rights through international legal and institutional mechanisms, including treaty body processes, actions by the International Criminal Court, and ongoing discussions regarding the codification of gender apartheid, to name a few. Our report is intended to contribute to those efforts by providing a structured, evidence-based legal analysis that can support informed decision-making across policy, legal, and humanitarian domains. Finally, while this report documents widespread violations, it also recognizes the ongoing efforts of Afghan women, girls, men, and their allies. Across Afghanistan and the diaspora, they continue to adapt, resist, and advocate, underscoring that this is not only a story of restriction, but also one of perseverance and continued demands for rights, accountability, and justice. With that, I conclude my remarks. I look forward to the insights of our distinguished panelists who will help us situate these findings within discussions of international law, accountability, and the future of women's and girls' rights in Afghanistan. Thank you. Dr. Samar, the floor is yours.
Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Thank you very much for joining us today. Thank you so much, Professor Dyan. You already mentioned the important points of the finding of this report. I would like to add a few more points to what you have mentioned and also request everyone to read the report as well. As we all know, the Taliban took power in August 2021 in Afghanistan. No other regime on this planet have erased half of the population from public life as the Taliban did in Afghanistan. So my point is, one, Afghanistan ratified CEDAW in 2003 without any reservation. Afghanistan's ratification of CEDAW was more than a symbolic act. It was a promise to the women and girls that their rights would be protected, their voices heard, and their future would be secured. Afghanistan's commitment and obligation to the international human rights law and principle that reject discrimination and guarantee equality, dignity, education, participation of women and girls in all aspects of life. However, the promises has not kept. Unfortunately, we are witnessing the systematic, institutionalized violation of the very principle enshrined in CEDAW. This is not the legal failure, but it is also moral one with full impunity. More than 120 laws, decrees, orders, and statements have been put in place, not based on the national or international principle, but based on personal opinions and mentality. Second, Documentation of this violation of human rights is very important, not only as a history to learn lessons from, but also promote accountability and justice. CEDAW is not only a document, it is a safeguard against injustice. When it is provisions are ignored, the impact is far beyond politics. They shape the culture and redefine the norms. In Afghanistan today, we are all seeing the dramatic increase of the culture of impunity. 3, a culture of impunity is one where a violation carry no consequences, where discrimination become normalized, where silence replace accountability. In such environment, inequality is not just practiced, it is empowering the patriarchy taught, inherited, and embedded into the fabric of society. When women and girls are excluded from public life, their absence become accepted as a normal. Over time, this oppression and restriction risks becoming internalized, not just enforced from above, but sustained from within the communities themselves. This is how culture shift, not overnight, but gradually through repeated injustice left unchallenged. And yet, it is precisely for this reason that CEDAW remains so vital. CEDAW is not only a legal framework, but also a moral compass as a basis of accountability. It offers the international community a base for accountability and a tool for resistance. It reminds us that women's rights are not negotiable, not culture or religion preference, but universal human rights. The question before us is not whether Afghanistan once committed to CEDAW. It did. The question is whether the international community will allow this commitment to be erased without consequences. 4, the denial of education and work to women and girls increases poverty in Afghanistan. It results in increase in child marriage and forced marriages, which have severe impact on the mother and child health. We witness the increase in mother and infant mortality rate. It steals the future of half of the population. Imagine if a young girl of age of 12 is forced to marry a man of 30 years old. She practically becomes a slave and under the complete control of the husband. She will not have control of her body and life. The Taliban in their recent law have legalized slavery. The husband is called the owner, and domestic violence has been legalized. Finally, accountability mechanism, including codification of gender apartheid in the Convention of Crimes Against Humanity, and sustained international advocacy are essential. Equally important is solidarity with Afghan women who continue to resist, to speak, and to hope despite the challenges. This is not just about Afghanistan. It is about the precedents we set if violation of CEDAW are met with silence. What message does this send to the world? What does it mean for the universality of human rights? In defending CEDAW, we must defend the principles that no regime, no authority, and no culture is above the human dignity of women. Let's not allow impunity to become a culture. Let's stand united for a culture of accountability, justice, dignity, and equality for everyone, everywhere, and all the time. And thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Samar. Ms. De Silva Del Weiss, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Seema, and thank you to Professor Dyan. I'm going to start with where Dr. Seema ended, and that is to address the fact that the CEDAW is the Global Bill of Rights for Women. It is inalienable, universal, and non-derogable, and accountability is the most powerful promise of the Convention. And that is why accountability and access to justice is the most urgent call to action for Afghan women. In the Shakespearean tragedy, Titus Andronicus, Lavinia, the rape victim, has her tongue cut and her hands cut off by Chiron and Demetrius to prevent her from identifying them after she is raped. Accountability efforts similarly must give Afghan women the right to reclaim their voices in accessing justice processes, to tell their narratives and to reclaim their dignity and to pierce the veil of impunity. We heard that the ICC and the ICJ are part of the justice processes. The ICC's arrest warrants against the Taliban High Authority for the first time charged gender as the only ground of persecution and establish accountability both for women and their allies. Secondly, in the first exercise of CEDAW's Article 29, which is the jurisdictional clause, the dispute settlement clause, calls for not only arbitration and negotiation, but also access to the ICJ, the International Court of Justice, the World Court. And under Article 62 of the ICJ statute, it calls for states, any state, to intervene if there is an interest in the legal nature that may be affected by the decision of the court. And as we already know, Australia, Netherlands, Canada, and Germany have come forward as interested party, but we call upon all members of the international community to come together and to come in front of the ICJ to exercise Article 62 of the ICJ as interested party, because of the fact that this is not only about Afghan women. This is about our own human condition and the rights of all women all over the world. I now look at the ways in which the extraordinary session of the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women and its committee heard from Afghan women directly last year. This is an extraordinary session because it was the first time where we did not invite a state party, given the abdication of the Taliban and the de facto authority in terms of the constitution. And I want to start with Article 1 and 2, the Supremacy Clause of the CEDAW, which calls for anti-discrimination and access to justice. As you probably know, Article 7 of the Afghan Constitution of 2004 enshrines Afghanistan's guarantee to observe all international treaties, including the CEDAW. The stunning suspension of the Constitution and its equality provisions is a rollback of generational progress for women and is a clear abrogation of the CEDAW's Articles 1 and 2. The erasure of both de facto and de jure, both in law and in practice equality, and the formal and substantive equality. Formal equality, the equality under law, and substantive equality, equality of result, which includes a quota of 30% women in the Afghan parliament, as was enshrined in the constitution, has now been rolled back and is a gross violation of Articles 1 and 2 of the CEDAW. The denial of justice and the miasma of impunity is a severe violation of the anti-discrimination clause of the CEDAW. The narrowing, the shrinking of the civic space for women, including for different ethnic minorities and women political dissenters and journalists, erode the rule of law and due process for women. The rights to peaceful assembly and association of Afghan women is fundamental to the rule of law and equality before the law under the CEDAW. Afghan women's deprivation of liberty without due process and the impunity in the criminal justice system erode CEDAW's Articles 1 and 2. The violation of the freedom of assembly by banning visits from public parks to gyms to beauty salons, as well as travel without a male guardian, is a curtailment of women's autonomy, agency, and freedom of expression. And this goes to the crackdown on NGOs and media organizations, especially those headed by women, which contradict the right to free speech, freedom of association and assembly, and is an attack on the anti-discrimination guarantees set out under the CEDAW. So I now go on to Article 3 of the CEDAW, which focuses on the national machineries for human rights and gender equality. We heard that the arbitrary dismantling of the Ministry of Women's Affairs and its replacement with the Ministry of Promotion of Virtue and the Prevention of Vice in early September 2021 is a clear abrogation of Article 3. Moreover, in August 2024, the Taliban supreme leader promulgated the law on the promotion of virtue and the prevention of vice, a 114-page law that prohibits a wide range of conduct and serves to erase women from the public sphere. And when announced in the stoning edict under this law, the Taliban supreme leader stated that, and I quote, "We will flog the women, we will stone them to death in public for crimes." Article 4 of the CEDAW goes to the heart of substantive equality and calls for temporary special measures, including affirmative action, to address the legacy of discrimination against women. And as you know, the Afghan constitution provided for at least 2 female delegates to be elected from each province. That too has been abrogated and erased. Article 5 goes to the very heart, the beating heart of the Taliban's over 100 edicts. The resurgence of harmful traditional practices such as the Maran law, the guardianship edicts, the husband obedience edicts, these all contradict Article 5 of the CEDAW. Along with ICCPR's General Comment, the International Convention on Civil and Political Rights, General Comment 28, Article 5 of the CEDAW calls for and argues that cultural characteristics cannot be allowed to undermine the principles of the universality of human rights, which remain inalienable, non-negotiable, and non-derogable. Article 6 is a prohibition of trafficking in women. And the Taliban's institutional and structural violence have made trafficking of hunger brides and trafficking in famine brides of children a norm and pervasive, and this is a clear prohibition and clear contradiction of Article 6. Article 7 is about women's leadership in public life, and the erasure of women from leadership and public life continues to be a violation of Article 7. Article 8 calls for women's equal representation on the global stage, and what we see that in the Doha talks, the absence of women. And this constitutes a clear violation of Article 8. Article 9 calls for the nationality rights. And as we know, just before the fall of Kabul and the takeover of the Taliban, that the ID card or tazkira was a vital part of women's economic participation. And women in Afghanistan fought to have their names included in the tazkira, the ID card. And this erasure of women in the ID cards constitutes a clear violation of nationality rights. And then I go to Article 10 of the CEDAW, which I think is probably the most important guarantee that has been violated by the Taliban. That is the complete and deliberate erasure of women and women's and girls' access to education. I've spoken and written widely about Article 10 and its application in Afghanistan, but I want to today, because of the limitations of time, just to address the fact that the UNESCO's 5 cardinal principles on access to education calls for education as a right to learn to know. And secondly, learning to transform oneself and society. I often ask, what is it about a girl with a book that so frightens a man with a gun? That is because of education's power to transform oneself and to transform society. So what is at stake here is the denial and the systemic denial of women's and girls' education in Afghanistan because of the threat that it creates to transforming society, to be an empowered society, and to address misogyny, fundamentalism, and other forms of extremism is a threat to Taliban's mission and agenda. Dr. Seema Sama spoke very articulately about Article 12 and the gender equality in health. I will look at Article 14 on women of intersectional identity. Article 14 covers a constellation of guarantees, including the rights of minority women. As you know, the Afghan constitution enshrined that the nation of Afghanistan shall be comprised of Pashtun, Tajik, Hazara, Uzbek, Turkmen, Baluk. It goes on to name all of the different ethnic groups and tribes, and that the word Afghan shall apply to every citizen of Afghanistan. So it is these women of intersectional identity who are the most affected by the Taliban edicts. And then finally, Articles 15 and 16 call for equality under law and equality in the family. As was said, there is a spike in child marriage. There's a spike in what's called famine brides and hunger brides in violation of Article 16. And the arbitrary and extrajudicial arrest and detention of Afghan women activists, journalists, and human rights defenders without access to justice, fair trial, and due process under law constitutes a violation of not just one article of the CEDAW 16 substantive articles, but every single article of the CEDAW, including the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which constitutes inalienable and universal rights guarantees for all. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. De Silva de Alwais, for that comprehensive comments and walk through CEDAW. That was really important. I really learned a lot from you. Thank you so much. Mr. Bennett, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Professor Dyan. I warmly congratulate the authors, especially you and Dr. Seema, as well as the other authors, on your rigorous and timely report, which makes a significant contribution to our understanding of the systematic nature of violations affecting women and girls in Afghanistan today, as we have heard from you already, and also very eloquently from Professor Rangita in relation to the various articles of CEDAW. That lays a vital foundation on which I'll build my remarks, which look perhaps a little more broadly at the human rights situation in Afghanistan. The situation has deteriorated dramatically since the Taliban took control in August 2021. The Afghan people have been subjected to sustained oppression and widespread rights violations, including the shrinking of civic space, severe restrictions on media and freedom of expression, arbitrary arrest and unlawful detention, corporal punishment and torture, targeted killings, including of former security forces, government officials, and human rights activists, enforced disappearances, and the oppression of minority and marginalized groups, among others. Even without referring to the atrocious and unlawful treatment of women and girls, the human rights situation would be extremely serious. This situation is compounded by a worsening humanitarian crisis, massive cuts in international aid, and the largely involuntary return of millions of Afghans from neighboring countries. Of particular concern is the recent ongoing conflict between Pakistan and the de facto authorities, including the March 16th airstrike on a drug rehabilitation facility in Kabul, which reportedly killed and injured hundreds of civilians. While the human rights situation for all Afghans is dire, as we've heard, women and girls are bearing the brunt of these conditions. Since retaking power, the Taliban has issued a litany of decrees and edicts, as rigorously analyzed in this report and by previous speakers, which deprive women and girls of their fundamental rights, including freedom of movement, education, work, healthcare, expression and association, access to justice, and participation in public life. In the past 4.5 years, not one of these decrees or edicts has been rescinded or reversed. Instead, these measures have increasingly been formalized into so-called laws, such as the Vice and Virtue Law, already mentioned, and most recently, the criminal rules of courts. Other recent Taliban decrees also raise serious concerns. These measures stand in clear violation of Afghanistan's obligations under international human rights law, including CEDAW, to which Afghanistan remains a state party. The Taliban's violations of the rights of women and girls are so severe, widespread, and systematic that I've concluded they constitute an attack against the civilian population that may amount to crimes against humanity, in particular gender persecution. And as Dr. Samar already noted, the International Criminal Court has issued arrest warrants, including for this crime, against 2 top Taliban leaders. My recent report on the right to health for women and girls finds that the return of the Taliban has intensified pre-existing challenges in the health sector while imposing new barriers that severely limit women's access to health services and information, as well as their capacity to make autonomous decisions about their bodies and health. At the core of these barriers are gender oppressive policies, including requirements for male permission to access services, segregated facilities, restrictions on women health workers, bans on medical education for women, restrictions on sexual, reproductive, and maternal and mental health care, and limited access to health-related information, all of which have created a system in which women's rights to health is systematically denied. These restrictions are particularly visible within the health workforce itself. The health sector has been one of the few in which women have been permitted to work. However, health workers have repeatedly reported that this exemption is inconsistently applied, frequently subjected to local interpretation, and vulnerable to sudden reversal. At the same time, deteriorating work conditions, increased surveillance, and persistent uncertainty are driving burnout and attrition among women health workers. The situation is further compounded by restrictions on education. The ban on secondary and higher education, including medical and health training, has effectively halted the pipeline of new women health professionals. This ban is entirely unjustifiable and, if not reversed, will lead to unnecessary suffering, illness, and death, and could amount to femicide. In many parts of the country, de facto authorities have restricted the supply of contraceptives by confiscating its stocks, driving up prices, and reducing availability. In addition, health workers report being warned not to provide family planning information. These systematic barriers are now translating into increasingly severe health outcomes. Many health workers have reported a worrying increase in maternal deaths and pregnancy-related complications. Without urgent and sustained international action, Afghanistan faces an alarming trajectory. The consequences are immediate, cumulative, and long-lasting. The situation I've described for the health sector applies to other sectors as well. For example, last year, I wrote a report on women and girls' access to justice and protection and reached similarly dire conclusions. Additionally, the role of the United Nations and the broader international community is not only to monitor, but also to respond meaningfully to ongoing patterns of human rights violations. This includes strengthening independent monitoring and reporting mechanisms, ensuring sustained international attention, and supporting efforts towards accountability through existing international legal frameworks. A strategy should include, and these some recommendations that I will finish off with. 1, placing women's rights, voices, and agency at the center of all discussions and processes related to Afghanistan. 2, establishing clear human rights benchmarks for engagement with the Taliban, ensuring there is no normalization without significant, demonstrable, and verified improvements in human rights, particularly the rights of women and girls. 3, ensuring international accountability, including through support for processes at the ICC and, where appropriate, the ICJ. 4, urgently operationalize and strengthen the newly established independent investigative mechanism for Afghanistan to collect, preserve, and analyze evidence of serious human rights violations and international crimes in Afghanistan, in complementarity with the work of my mandate. 5, codified the crime of gender apartheid. 6, strengthen and sustain support for civil society, in particular Afghan-led and women-led NGOs. This means flexible, long-term and sustainable funding while ensuring that these groups lead in setting priorities. 6, fully funding the humanitarian response for Afghanistan. 7, expanding economic and educational empowerment opportunities for women and girls in Afghanistan. And last but not least, supporting refugees, including strictly respecting the principle of non-refoulement, sustained support for host countries, and the expansion of humanitarian visas and complementary pathways. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Bennett, for your comprehensive response and for your very precise and clear recommendations. And thank you for your continued work. Mr. Hamidi, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Professor Dyan, and good morning, good day for everyone. I appreciate the work that Tufts University and the authors of this report done for observing and monitoring the situation of women's rights in Afghanistan and making the report based on CEDAW. The plight of Afghan women is more greater than to be measured by international instruments or international conventions. The Taliban are committing gender apartheid and crime against humanity, not just for the women of Afghanistan, but for all the population of Afghanistan every day, without fearing or without concern about responsibility or accountability. I appreciate the work of the Tufts University. We are living in a world that the world order based on human rights and global justice is weakening every day. The mechanisms that monitoring the situation of human rights, especially in Afghanistan, or monitoring the women's rights in Afghanistan, they are weakening day by day because the international order is now changing toward not to respect the principles of human rights. In this situation, the role of Afghan diaspora, the Afghan women rights groups, the Afghan women rights group is very vital, and especially the role of academia, universities for monitoring, for making reports, for providing information from Afghanistan and the Taliban policies against human rights, to raise awareness of people inside Afghanistan and also raise awareness of the public opinion outside of Afghanistan. I think this is a very important role, and also this will send a message, a strong message to the Taliban: we are watching you. And this documentation and these reports will provide a pay for future justice, for a transitional justice in Afghanistan. If you're speaking or in discourse of women's rights in Afghanistan and human rights in Afghanistan, if just looking to the current situation in Afghanistan, I think it's not a professional way or to find the solutions or also to look at to the root causes of these problems and this plight of women in Afghanistan. This plight and this process started from Doha negotiations between United States and Taliban for so-called bringing peace to Afghanistan. On that time, I can recall that every time the U.S. negotiator team coming to Kabul, coming to Afghanistan, the women rights groups, the human rights groups, the civil society, raising concern about the future of human rights and women, especially women's rights in Afghanistan. Several times they raised this concern because it was predictable from the beginning that by returning of Taliban, the primary victim of this process would be girls and women of Afghanistan. Beside all people of Afghanistan will be victim, but the most and primary victim would be women. And also I recall that the negotiator team of United States was trying to calm these groups, and even they created a new term of modern Taliban and changed Taliban. And they assured all those groups that the Taliban are changed and the Taliban are not the Taliban was before 2001. And we are not lefting you behind, and we will emphasize on women's rights and human rights in Afghanistan. I'm speaking about this one. Since the United States is involved in many conflicts and many peace negotiations around the world, the State Department or the responsible organization should have principled guideline how to preserve women's rights, human rights, and stick on principles during the peace negotiations. How to listen to the victims and how to listen to the suffering of those people living in the conflict. I think the situation now we are in, it started from the Doha process and also the Doha agreement and the Doha instrument that signed by United States and the Taliban. The other issue that when in 2001, the international community came to Afghanistan, led by the United States of America, and the new structure, political structure established for Afghanistan, the new constitution and the new laws and also the new mechanism in Afghanistan to provide services and to provide justice, to provide human rights and support women's rights in Afghanistan. One of the issues that the international community and especially the government of Afghanistan, because of the lack of political will for transitional justice, ignoring transitional justice paved the way for impunity culture from the crimes that the different functions and different parties committed in Afghanistan, including the Taliban. The Taliban passed the era of the power from 1995 to 2001 was ignored to implement justice or to brought to transitional justice. And it sent, unfortunately, a vague message to all parties of the country. Their crimes didn't address and the culture of impunity continued. One of the issues that I want to raise here is women's rights is not indivisible. If more than 20 million of women living in a regime of apartheid, unprecedented in any country or any society in the world, we cannot speak about women's rights globally. All the women's rights groups, all the human rights groups, the Afghan diaspora, the academia, and all international instruments and mechanisms should focus like they focus now. The only focus of the international community is about the oil prices and Hormuz Strait. We should bring in the focus, in the center of international opinion and international concerns, the women's rights and human rights, especially the situation now we are in Afghanistan. The women's rights, not the women's rights indivisible, and the consequences of this situation in Afghanistan, unfortunately, will harm other societies and will encourage other groups, extremist groups, to follow such policies and such politics in their societies anywhere else. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your comments and for your insights into the importance of peace processes and women's meaningful participation, a culture of impunity and what that does, and I think very important points about what the international community chooses to focus on and more widespread impunity for other groups as well. So with this, I would like to thank very much Mr. Bennett and Professor De Silva de Alwais. They have other commitments and are going to need to drop off. So thank you both very much for joining us and actually coming out of other meetings to speak with us. We really appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Thank you for the opportunity. It's been a pleasure. I wish you well for the rest of the webinar.
Thank you. So what I'd like to do now is go to the questions we have coming in from our audience. And we will ask Dr. Samar and Mr. Hamidi to respond to these. So the first question is, do the Taliban's policies rise to gender apartheid as a crime against humanity? And if so, how meaningful is that classification for accountability and real change?
I think it constitutes the crime against humanity. And as you are ever aware of that, when the ICC issued arrest warrant for two leaders of the Taliban, the supreme leader and also the chief justice of Taliban. But this, in a broad interpretation of the Article 7 or 8 of the ICC about the persecution of gender-based persecution. But unfortunately, when the Taliban was ruling in 1995 in Afghanistan, and the situation was the same, now we are in. And the drafting committee of the ICC was drafting the laws of the Rome Statute. Here is a big question: why they were not included the gender-based crimes or gender apartheid crime as a crime against humanity, certainly in the ICC, and still the Afghan diaspora is working, especially women rights groups and human rights groups, to put pressure on the international community to criminalize the gender apartheid. And other elements of the Taliban are committing against the people of Afghanistan, especially against the women of Afghanistan. The international instruments, unfortunately, they are not moving or they are not developing their instruments according to the situation now we are in Afghanistan. It's almost 4.5 years the people of Afghanistan is wanting the international community to criminalize gender apartheid. Mr. Richard Bennett mentioned before that the Taliban didn't amend it or didn't reverse their laws and policies about women. But international community also, they didn't provide sufficient ground for bringing justice against the Taliban. Those are responsible for their crimes.
Thank you. Dr. Samar?
Yes, I just wanted to add what Hamidi said. The Taliban rule in Afghanistan in the 90s, when they were in power from 1995 to 2001, actually they were applying the gender apartheid, and it's a small group of us. We were calling Stop Gender Apartheid. And this is 1998 when I joined on those activities. Honestly, we did not continue our fight for codification of the gender apartheid, because I thought that they will never come to power again. And now I understand that we made a mistake. So the importance of codification of this crime is key, because we don't have such a crime codified either in the international law or in Afghanistan law to be punishable, to keep these people accountable for it. So I think it's really important. I don't know how long it will take, because we need the people, the member of the General Assembly of the United Nations, to the majority to support this idea. We're still struggling. It's only 12 countries until now who promised the support for codification of gender apartheid. So there is, unfortunately, we all know that there's politics is more important in the United Nations, and they are struggling, particularly the 5 member of the United Nations Security Council, permanent member of the United Nations Security Council, is not really interested to push for codification of gender apartheid. I think it's the responsibility of all of us who wants to see justice and promote accountability for sexual gender-based violence. And anywhere, not only in Afghanistan, it will help to reduce the culture of impunity, and we have to fight for it. And it's long, long, long fight.
Thank you very much. The next question is, you both mentioned ways, and Mr. Bennett talked about it more extensively, that the international community should engage with or hold the Taliban in Afghanistan responsible for reversing their commitments on CEDAW. The question is, how do you see this happening in a context where Taliban does not accept these commitments, does not accept these laws, and the world doesn't recognize them as legitimate government? What are some ways that the international community should try to hold them responsible?
I think Richard Bennett already put on his recommendation what the international community should do. The problem is that these are international law, and the international community has the responsibility to protect this law, to safeguard this law. And that should be the reason to pressurize the Taliban. Whenever they talk with the Taliban, for any reason, they have to mention that this is the Afghanistan obligation. The violation of these laws and conventions is a crime. Particularly the violation of CEDAW is a crime against humanity. All the others are also, of course, crime. And that should be the reason that all the other countries push the Taliban. And the other point that I would like to mention here, that yes, with all this advocacy that we did, we were able to stop the recognition of the Taliban by the international community. It's only Russia who recognized the Taliban regime. That was, in my personal view, in response to the Syria by the other country, the recognition of Syria regime by the other country. It's a politics rather than a principle of human rights and the center of the decision. It's some other countries who exchange the ambassador or consular, but yet they think, as I said in my comments, that it's a sign of normalization of the Taliban violation of human rights. And that sign is very, very dangerous. It's already normalized within Afghanistan. Now the people doesn't see the women. It's fine for them, or they don't see their daughters and sisters going to university. It's become normal. And now the international community almost do the same thing. We had a comment by the EU representative by saying that, yeah, the majority of the people are happy with the Taliban. We say, as an advocate against the Taliban regime and dictatorship, yes, if the majority of the people are happy with Taliban, why they're not going to election? Go to election. If the people really support them and elect them, then we are happy. But they don't go to that because they believe that they are the one who has to correct the country and the people, and mainly women, of course.
I think one of the issue that we have instruments and mechanism at the international level for making Taliban responsible or accountable for their actions, but lack of political will of the governments or the organizations based on politics. I think this is one of the biggest problem of the new era of human rights, especially looking to Afghanistan. The women groups, the human rights groups, they have a vital role to feel that they are Afghans and they are in Afghanistan. As I mentioned before, if we separate the women of Afghanistan and saying that like Dr. Said Samar mentioned. Some saying is that people are happy in Afghanistan. The cultural relativism is one of the issue that some countries speaking in Afghanistan. This is not true. If the 20 million women in Afghanistan and more than 15 million girls are deprived of their rights, especially education, it means that the women rights is violated, not just in Afghanistan, in the entire humanity. If every organization or people outside Afghanistan feel that they are Afghans, men and women, and they put pressure on their governments to implement all the instruments and the leverage that the international community have to make Taliban responsible, it will happen.
All right, at that, unfortunately, we have more questions. We were unable to get to them. Our time is up. I want to thank everyone for joining. In particular, I want to thank our distinguished panelists for their thoughtful and deeply informed contributions, and for all of you for joining this discussions. As today's conversation underscored, the issues examined in this report sit at the intersection of law, policy, lived reality, politics, and are going to require sustained and careful engagement. We hope that the report serves as a useful resource for those working across these domains. We thank you again, and we look forward to continuing this dialogue going forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Can I have the last sentence?
Have the last word.
Yes, I would like to thank you, Dyan, and all our colleagues and students who helped with this, and the colleagues, the technical colleagues who facilitate the webinar, and thank you all who participated.